Hi there, I'm Anthony Randall, and I work at Monsanto. And today I'm going to be talking about identity data, or I guess an angle on identity data for scaling. So we'll be talking about Monsanto specific, but really more about what I've seen over the years in the industry. My background has been with vendors, research companies, and I've seen a lot of things over a lot of years in the identity space. And data is a particular passion of mine, so hence the topic. So we all know about this. There's a lot of growth out there right now. There's many more users, connected devices, and companies are finding different ways to expose through those devices, through those connectivity, access to services that have been traditionally provided over the phone, in person, shop fronts, etc. So we need to think about how to manage that growth from an information standpoint. Certainly, what I've seen is the IAM industry is catching up pretty well, and we're seeing in the last couple of years certainly many new protocols, standards, and tools to start addressing the new world of mobile cloud and the API economy. And here's just a sampling of vendors that particular interest that sort of show some promise in some areas, and certainly some of the standards there, such as SCIM, OpenID Connect, and many of the things you've heard about this week during the conference. But identity data is sort of lagging behind. There's not really been a lot of innovation. It's certainly an undercovered topic. There's not really a lot of talk, research papers about information management and how information is organized and managed. And what you probably see, what I've seen out there is we've got security in two places, typically. We have directory service, which is traditional IAM technology that's been around a long time. It's the first technology really in the space, but in some respects it's one of the least well understood pieces of technology for the age that it's been around. And then we obviously and see this a lot. We have hundreds of databases out there, so application specific silos that also have an element of security that stores, again, identities with sets of authorization in there. And this is really just a view of what that starts to look like. As I mentioned, there's lots of applications with their own application-specific silos, data stores. And then as we start to get into the cloud and use partners to store data, which we have to do business with them, we run the risk of starting to manage data that looks different to our environment out in the partner environment, and even worse, having less of a knowledge of that data within the systems that we own. So it's sort of that trackability, transparency, and visibility we can tend to lose as we start to manage identities in other different places and silos. And this week I've sat through quite a lot of sessions, and we've heard a lot about context, and certainly the newer and emerging protocols such as XACML, OpenID Connect, and UMA are really context-driven, context-heavy, which is good because if you look at the picture up there, there's certainly a lot of information, context, and relationships that really represent how people do online business today, work with governments or work or whatever it is, whatever company. There's just a growing number of relationships and dependencies, and they're data points. At the end of the day, when you talk about taking and putting information or providing online systems, they become business or data objects. And we're doing a bad job of representing those today. But one thing to call out specifically to customer identity is we do tend to have a lot of information about customers. They tend to be in systems like CRMs or or Salesforce now. And here's a sort of a representative example about the types of information that we store and use. And that information, more often than not, tends to stay in those CRM type systems and don't tend to find their way into the identity stores that give people access to things. We create application roles, security groups to denote how somebody gets access to things, and we start to struggle with how we manage those groups, and we can end up with hundreds and hundreds of those groups, and they're difficult to manage from a security standpoint, when all along we know that a customer, somebody that does business with a company, has information that we know about them that tends to provide enough context about who they are and what they do to actually do those things. Because we're doing it anyway in the real world, we're not representing that information within a good data structure. So, as I said, business context often remains in back office systems, and we sort of see that traditional picture of the customer there, and he calls up somebody on the phone, service desk, customer care, and they put information into CRM systems, and that's often where it stays. And identity management is often seen as a sort of a separate branch of the IT ecosystem, if you will, and we have separate processes that start to create identities and put groups in a system that sort of becomes disconnected from the reality and the context of a user. So we have on the left-hand side directory services is typically deployed that manages all those millions of customers, devices coming in and authenticating and trying to authorize to different systems. And yet we're spending a lot of money trying to do the same things over and over again, as I mentioned in directory, with our SaaS partners and with the application silos that we tend to create. So the job is trying to figure out how we get that context out of the back office and start to use it more meaningfully. So this may be a familiar topic to some, killing IAM in order to save it. Ian Glazer had a blog or talked about this a little while ago and talked about the need to be able to better define and describe business relationships and context for online activity. And this is sort of a way of looking at what a user or a subscriber and the relationships that they have to things may look like. It may look like this in your organization. This is just a representative example, and you can see that a subscriber or a user has really got a complex set of relationships with a lot of things, with things like devices. They may have accounts associated with themselves as a secondary, or somebody that works in the same dealership in Monsanto context, and a set of services that they're associated with them, and products and devices that they can use, and maybe multiple profiles and preferences for the different services that that a company may provide, and of course access methods. So this is the sort of viewpoint, and I think part of Ian's point was that traditionally we think about the CSV or hierarchical ways of storing data that really represent more sort of organizational information and less about that real-time context of data and how it relates to what it is that we do. So back to the future here a little bit, and as I said, directories have been around a long time, and I think to some degree they've left a bad taste in people's mouths. I think they're sort of misunderstood to a degree, but that being said, there's certainly vendors out there now that are really doubling down or focusing on directories and trying to make them, and even changing the name of the service, if you will, from directory services to virtual directories or just identity services. And they're becoming a lot more dynamic, a lot more relevant to the current landscape and supporting other types of protocols, if you will, to access data, not just LDAP, so for example REST and SQL. And They're able to do things that traditional directories haven't been able to do yet. But at the foundation, directories remain a business-oriented, object-based system. So you're able to create objects and represent them and update those with attributes that represent the things that describe a device, a relationship, a service, a product, what it is you can do with the company that you're doing business for. And typically, what we've seen is that on the right-hand side, the databases, they represent a single process. So you have lots of databases for representing single processes that don't really represent that relationship of one person or subscriber accessing or interacting with many services. So this is a representation about how I think about representing information. And again, this is a representation of how you can think about storing information. And it's broken down into namespaces. The triangles sort of represent a namespace. And you can see it's not just one namespace with users. It's got separate namespaces that represent different capabilities, different applications, things that are tied to users that we can see today. So a user has a relationship to a product, for example, that they may, or a service that they subscribe to, profiles that are related to the user and how they use individual products and services, devices that they may own, and there may be multiple devices, and entitlements and roles that relate to the services that we may provide that user, if it's a bundle, for example, if they're a gold subscriber or something like that. And then from a relationship standpoint, if you have this sort of if you can imagine a flat hierarchy of namespaces with information that is associated across them to a single user, you can start to tie that information together using something like GUID, so that you can either virtualize or aggregate or make calls to the user information object that can spawn out other calls to start to tie that informational relationship information together. So adding all that data up, then you start to see a picture forming that provides, or that uses business context, and really that starts, the business context, you've got to start to understand business use cases, and I think I heard in the talk earlier, it's sort of understanding that bigger picture and seeing what the vision and the plan is to provide services to customers. And typically it's not just one thing, although it can be, and understanding the information about what it is that entitles or allows a user, a subscriber, a customer to access such data is important information to then start to figure out how the relationships start to form, which then in turn lead into providing context to build out information services or directory services to represent each object and scale those accordingly based on usage. So we start to go to the next picture, which forms more of a logical architecture, and you start to see specifically in the red box the directory namespaces that I've called out that provide different capabilities which different applications and services can start to call. And then you see below that the example here being virtual machines. So you're able to scale individual namespaces based on the type of usage it is. So an example of that might be a namespace. So imagine that you're signing up for a new service, you want to choose a name, then that name process, that name changing, is a separate process on a directory system, if you will, that needs to be scaled according or specific to its usage, whilst other namespaces may manage how things are being provisioned, updated, or written to. So different systems can operate on different parts of the namespace that can be scaled according to any business use. And then as the user or even billing or CRM systems start to interact with these systems, then data can be updated based on that data model to update those entries and keep them relevant with either self-managed or process-managed information that represents the user. So coming out of that, two things to point out with information systems or identity systems is they not only can derive or drive or enable applications directly with things like authentication and access, they also start to paint a picture, an enterprise picture from a single user view standpoint of who it is and what I can do, so that other systems, for example, like help desk or support or customer care, can start to use that identity repository as a place to see not just what's enabled, but what's in other systems as well. So an example of that might be if you have privileges to a SaaS provider, a federation, then that information is represented in the directory, although your direct access may be externally managed or hosted, or even devices. So coming from the cable world in part of my past, things like cable modems, they don't rely on directory services to authenticate, but that information about the devices that may be delivered through from that service can be represented and associated to that subscriber or customer, so that you can provide that full support, see that single customer view, such that you're not going to multiple different systems to try and figure out and paint a picture of how I can solve an individual user's problem. And the better context we have, the better the recipe is for working with cloud providers. When I think about information, we're typically at the mercy of, I think, vendors to some degree, and certainly cloud providers. And we know that there's a certain amount of customization that we can lose out on when we work with other partners, but the value and the speed and the agility and the flexibility to a degree is comes part of that relationship, and it sort of supersedes. But the more we can use the business context in our world and language, or the particular company, and use that same information set to derive a role or a capability in how we describe them, then the better that we can, or the less we're creating these random roles in different systems that start to become less connected, if you will, or paint a more looser picture with how we represent identity. And this providing better context and access to data and describing it well and describing those relationships well start to provide a better picture for this new sort of cloud and API-centric device-based ecosystem that we're now building. And this requires a closer integration with data architecture. And what I mean about that is, certainly in my past, and you may have seen it yourself, data architecture teams tend to work independently or separate to identity teams, but we're all sort of solving the same problem sets. But so religious warfare, I guess, is one way to put it, quite often happens where one set of systems do one thing and another set does another, and never the twain shall meet. But to start delivering a full ecosystem of services, then those teams have to get together to start the bigger conversation about what it is we're providing now through our front door, as I call it. We're accessing services in a totally different way from the way that we've built systems over time to deliver capabilities or services from back office aspects where somebody's on a phone and something's done manually and something's done in the network. Now we want to get on devices and click to set up and create new accounts to access new capabilities. And this sort of represents that sort of ecosystem where services can access the data that they need based on the types of devices or applications that are accessing those data to do different operations or consume different services across the ecosystem. So to make progress based on what I've talked about then, there's some things that we need to do that we can do a better job of, I believe, and that's to start to move away from this landscape of hundreds of databases out there, which become hard to manage, they're expensive, and move more towards providing that single identity layer that multiple services and applications can consume. And I'll talk a little bit about how we can do that in the next steps, and sort of, I guess, a few takeaways. And really, there's tools out there that will start to give us better information, a better handle on the number of identities out there. I'm pretty sure that most of you have got multiple databases in the organization, and I think of the principles of this concept being applicable to both customers, business partners, versus the enterprise. We've both got sort of perspectives have got the same problem set within the environments, and certainly tools out there can start to help us get a handle of what is out there, what are all the identities out there, how many IDs do people have, what systems do they use, such that we can use these tools to discover, map, and clean up duplicate identities. And the VDS there that I've called out in the red picture is virtual directory services. That's a good tactical tool to start to solve that problem of managing and meshing multiple user identities out there. And again, the same tools can understand what applications are using which identity stores or even databases, because quite often or not, that's unknown. And these types of tools can help to capture that information so you can start to build out taxonomy of applications and sort of start to put the house in order and really understand what it is that's out there and how you can optimize the environment to take advantage of systems that are built to scale that describe context. And then some of some more next steps here in talk about transitioning authentication to new tools. So once you've figured out how to map identities and take 5 or 6 down to one identity, and then looked at the applications and understand how they authenticate and where they're authenticating, then tools like a virtual directory can start to seamlessly sit over the top of the authentication point that applications use, such that you can start to do that work on the back end of cleaning up and retiring, if necessary, the databases that exist out there. And then use the context in the systems that you own and start to build a richer set of user context. Really start to understand what the criteria is for users that need to access systems actually is, and ensure that information is represented in information objects and schema. And one thing to remember is the billing systems or CRM systems typically exist out there. They don't tend to authenticate users, but they have all that user context-rich information. And then start to build systems that represent the business context of users and what they do, and know that to support millions of users, it needs to be scalable, distributed, and secure. So when you get back to the office, I think it's definitely a good idea to understand what the vision is for customer centricity. I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with some of my colleagues and different business owners, and we started to talk about the need to improve the user experience just from a single sign-on aspect. And I'm trying to think about how we have that conversation, and really it's a conversation that almost doesn't need to take place, because it's pretty obvious the business wants to provide that good user experience, but sometimes the gap in trying to get there is hard to articulate. So for example, if I come and say, guess what, I can reduce these databases, I can do this, and it's going to cost $2 million, then that's sort of a tactical step that gets you to perhaps using one less or a number of less IDs to access systems, but what's that real view? What are we trying to get to from a user centricity standpoint? And then start to clean up the identity silos, as I mentioned, that cause a disconnected view of the customer, and then start to change legacy mindsets, get involved with the enterprise architecture teams out there and start to figure out what that ecosystem of transactions of information, that sort of end-to-end looks like, and how you build data and represent that to represent business capability and use cases. And then start to correlate insufficient technology investments to current problem sets. We pretty much know what the problem sets are out there from an identity standpoint, and it's more often than not, investment gets driven from new product types of ventures versus that core investment that starts to build that stable base to start building foundational principles to add new products and services onto that base. And then obviously build a business case and understand the dimensions of what it is you're trying to do, the numbers of users, what they're trying to access, the scale, and the security that needs to fall in pretty closely behind that. So that's pretty much it. I raced through fairly quickly, had a lot of slides, so I don't know if there's any questions. Yes.
Well, you were talking specifically for the internal application part of it. Have you addressed how you would approach the SaaS, provisioning of SaaS partners?
So really this was just a viewpoint on customer identity, if you will, and talking about how we represent information internally. I'm not sure if you're getting to SaaS in terms of IDaaS or just applications. Well, there's different ways of doing that. From a SAML standpoint, there's some element of provisioning there. And then I'm certainly encouraged by SCIM and that evolving standard and looking for more support. But yeah, directory services or products like Ping, access management servers, can support that as a protocol. But that's sort of in its infancy right now. Yep.
That's a clear project where we're working with a data architect, master data management around customer identities, and specifically around where different repositories like email marketing, CRM, ERP, and so forth that create information about customers. So on data law, do you have any recommendations of how to keep all those in line, other than ID relationships, how to figure out how to link together?
Yeah, yeah. From my perspective, that's where data governance starts to come into play and start to build information sets, if you will. Having data dictionaries that people can start to agree on what information, what single pieces of information or many pieces of information start to represent how we label and describe customers, and then start to use those across the different systems. So in one aspect, at least the language we're using is consistent. If it's consistent in those places, when we start to add them to systems that authenticate and authorize users, and we use the same language, then it becomes a lot easier to manage that data. And certainly things like provisioning systems, different ETL or processes can start to help to keep that data synchronized. But really it's trying to form a way to talk about the same things with a common language and a common description and stay within that. And I think that's why we have to be part of the conversation more from an identity standpoint. Yes? So we're starting on the journey, really there. I think the pitfalls is I think it's fairly common in my experience and in the past and also right now, it's the investment. This is a sort of a glue or a foundational investment that can take a lot of money, and sometimes priorities can be different. They can be specifically product or service focused. So it's really trying to build that picture and understand that vision for customer centricity, as I mentioned in the last slide, and trying to map some of the investments to the gaps in capability that we have and bring that together. And that's never been, and it currently isn't, an easy conversation to articulate. Well, thanks very much. Appreciate it.